After the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, the Muslim world stood on the edge of a great unknown. For years, the believers had drawn their strength, direction, and unity from a single light, the Prophet himself. His guidance had been the anchor of their faith, the voice of divine revelation, and the embodiment of mercy. But now, that voice had gone silent. The earth had grown still with grief, and the question that loomed heavy over every heart was simple, yet overwhelming. What comes next? In that moment of sorrow and uncertainty, a new chapter of Islamic history began. One not led by prophets, but by men whose hearts were trained in the Prophet's shadow. These were not monarchs or emperors. They did not ascend thrones or inherit crowns. Instead, they were chosen for their character, their closeness to the messenger, and the depth of their conviction. They were known as the Khulafa ar-Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs. Men who would carry the torch of Islam forward, not through conquest alone, but through justice, humility, and spiritual vision. Their leadership was not marked by grandeur, but by grit. At every turn, they faced challenges that could have shattered any ordinary leadership: internal rebellions, external threats, social upheaval, and the ever-present burden of maintaining unity in a rapidly expanding empire. And yet, with every trial, they responded not with ego or ambition, but with a deep sense of accountability to Allah and to the people they served. Their names, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, are etched into the history of Islam, but the depth of their stories is often lost in the shadows of time. Behind each name lies a life of sacrifice, of sleepless nights, of prayers whispered through tears, and decisions made with trembling hearts that feared only God. This is not simply the story of leadership. It is the untold story of four men who turned faith into action, governance into worship, and power into service. Through them, the light of the Prophet continued to shine. When the Prophet Muhammad passed away, the entire city of Medina was cloaked in sorrow. Grief, confusion, and disbelief hung in the air like a storm. Even Umar ibn al-Khattab, known for his strength and resolve, could not bring himself to accept the truth. He stood before the people, sword in hand, warning that anyone who claimed the Prophet had died would feel his wrath. The atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty, hearts fractured by the weight of loss. And then came Abu Bakr. With steady steps and eyes filled with pain but anchored in faith, Abu Bakr walked into the Prophet's mosque. He approached the lifeless body of his dearest friend and gently lifted the cloth from his blessed face. He leaned in and kissed his forehead, whispering, "You were beautiful in life and beautiful in death." Then he turned to the trembling crowd and delivered the words that would pierce through the fog of grief and restore clarity to the shaken Ummah. "Whoever worships Muhammad, know that Muhammad is dead. But whoever worships Allah, know that Allah is ever living and never dies." In that moment, Abu Bakr reminded the believers that their faith was not built upon a man, no matter how beloved, but upon the eternal truth of Allah. Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, the first man to believe in the Prophet outside of his household, had always been a pillar of unwavering support. He was the Prophet's closest companion, his confidant, and the man who accompanied him on the perilous journey of the Hijrah, hiding in the cave of Thar as their enemies searched for them. In that cave, when fear crept in, it was Abu Bakr whom the Prophet comforted with the words, "Do not be afraid, for Allah is with us." Abu Bakr's faith was so deep, so pure, that he was given the title al-Siddiq, the truthful, the one who confirmed without hesitation. When the burden of leadership fell upon his shoulders, Abu Bakr did not seek it. He accepted it only out of duty, knowing the weight it carried. His caliphate began in the most fragile period of the Muslim community. The Prophet had just departed from the world, and the unity he forged was now in danger of unraveling. Tribes began to rebel. Some refused to pay zakat. Others followed false prophets claiming to carry new revelations. It was chaos at the edge of collapse, but Abu Bakr did not flinch. With quiet determination, he declared, "By Allah, I will fight anyone who separates prayer from zakat." His resolve shocked even Umar, who initially questioned the decision. But Abu Bakr made it clear, the religion was whole and complete. It was not for anyone to divide or dilute its principles. Under his leadership, the Ridda Wars were launched to bring the renegade tribes back into the fold of Islam. Through courage and clarity, he preserved not only the faith but the fabric of the community. Yet Abu Bakr was not a leader of sword alone. His foresight proved vital in preserving the Qur'an itself. After the Battle of Yamama, where many companions who had memorized the Qur'an were martyred, Umar urged him to compile the sacred text in a single manuscript. At first, Abu Bakr hesitated, fearful of doing something the Prophet himself had not done. But recognizing the danger of losing portions of the revelation, he entrusted the task to Zayd ibn Thabit, supervising the process with the utmost care and reverence. This act of preservation would become one of the greatest services to Islam, ensuring that the words of Allah would endure unaltered for generations to come. Despite the weight of his position, Abu Bakr lived with simplicity. He continued to work in the marketplace even after becoming caliph, until it was pointed out that he could not serve the people and maintain his trade. A modest salary was arranged, just enough for him and his family to live. He led with humility, never allowing the power of leadership to cloud the purity of his intentions. His home remained humble, his heart remained soft, and his eyes were often filled with tears in prayer. Abu Bakr's caliphate lasted only 2 years, but the legacy he left behind was immense. He stabilized the foundation of the Muslim state, quelled internal rebellion, preserved the Qur'an, and ensured that Islam remained intact at a time when it could have easily fractured. As death approached him, he remained calm, knowing he had done his duty. He chose Umar as his successor, not out of favoritism, but out of trust in his leadership and sense of justice. He was buried beside his beloved Prophet in the chamber of Aisha, where the fragrance of revelation still lingered. And just like that, the man who had stood by the Prophet in life and in death, who had been his shadow and shield, returned to the dust, leaving behind the unshakable imprint of a friend who never wavered, a leader who never faltered, and a believer who never doubted. In Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, the Ummah found its anchor. Through him, the transition from prophecy to leadership was made not with grandeur, but with grace. He proved that true strength is quiet, and true leadership is rooted not in power, but in unwavering devotion to truth. When Umar ibn al-Khattab became the second caliph of Islam, the world already knew his name. Before Islam, he was known for his strength, his fierce temper, and his commanding presence in Quraysh society. But when the light of Islam entered his heart, it transformed him into something greater. The same fire that once fueled his opposition to the Prophet Muhammad now burned with unwavering devotion to truth, justice, and the service of Allah. His acceptance of Islam was not just a personal turning point. It was a moment that shook the hearts of the disbelievers. The Muslims, once forced to hide their faith, marched publicly to the Kaaba behind Umar, who declared to the world that Islam no longer belonged in the shadows. When Abu Bakr passed away and appointed Umar as his successor, there was hesitation among some companions. They remembered his firmness, his sharp words, and his unyielding nature. But Abu Bakr saw beyond that. He saw a man who feared Allah more than he feared the world. He saw a leader whose strength would become the shield of the Ummah in a time of expansion, challenges, and rapid change. As caliph, Umar's reign was marked by transformation. The Islamic State, once centered in Medina, was rapidly growing. Lands were opening: Persia, Egypt, the Levant. But conquest was never Umar's goal. Justice was. He didn't seek to expand the empire through cruelty or greed, but through the message of Islam and the establishment of just governance. Every inch of new territory came with the responsibility of administering it with fairness and wisdom. And Umar rose to that task with brilliance and humility. He walked among the people at night, disguised, listening to their needs, their complaints, their cries. He established a welfare system, ensuring that no one in the Muslim lands would sleep hungry. Widows, orphans, and the poor received stipends from the public treasury. He appointed judges across the provinces, separating judicial authority from the military and executive branches. He introduced a system of accountability where governors and officials could be questioned and even dismissed if they misused power. No one was above the law, not even himself. One of the most profound stories of his leadership came during a time of severe famine. Umar, who had once enjoyed the simple luxury of meat and oil, refused to eat anything beyond dry bread and olive oil until the people were fed. His cheeks grew hollow and his face pale. When asked why he did this, he replied, "How can I be concerned with the needs of my people if I do not taste their hunger?" His leadership was not performed from a throne, but from the front lines of hardship. Umar's humility was legendary. Once, a man came from afar and could not distinguish Umar from the common people. He found him sleeping beneath a tree, covered only by his cloak, with no guards in sight. The man wept, saying, "You ruled with justice, so you sleep in peace." That was the essence of Umar's caliphate. Power never changed him, the world never softened him, and fear of Allah never left him. Under his leadership, the Muslim army did not merely conquer, it liberated. When Jerusalem was surrendered to the Muslims, its Christian leaders requested that the caliph himself come to receive the keys of the city. Umar traveled from Medina, riding a humble camel with a single servant, alternating who rode and who walked. When they reached the city, it was the servant's turn to ride, and Umar walked barefoot, his clothes dusty and patched. The people of Jerusalem watched in awe, expecting a man of gold and armor, but witnessing a servant of God who embodied humility. He entered the city not as a tyrant, but as a guardian of its sacred trust. When offered a place to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he refused, not out of disrespect, but to preserve its status for the Christians. He chose instead to pray outside, ensuring that future Muslims would not lay claim to the church as a mosque. His wisdom in that single moment echoes through centuries of interfaith coexistence. Umar also pioneered many civil systems. He introduced the Islamic calendar, counting from the Hijra. He created a census, established administrative provinces, and began public works like roads, canals, and rest stops for travelers. He organized a national registry of soldiers and their salaries. He even appointed a special department to investigate complaints against public officials. These were not just policies. They were manifestations of his deep commitment to justice and the welfare of the Ummah. But his time would not last forever. In the final years of his rule, while leading the Fajr prayer in the Prophet's mosque, Umar was attacked by a Persian slave named Abu Lu'lu'a. The blade was poisoned and the wounds were deep. As he lay in his final days, he did not ask for vengeance. He asked if his debt was settled, if the people were satisfied with his leadership, and if he would be allowed to be buried beside his two beloved companions, Prophet Muhammad and Abu Bakr. His final request was granted, and he was laid to rest beside the very men who shaped his journey from opposition to leadership. Umar ibn al-Khattab was not just a caliph, he was a reformer, a visionary, and a servant of truth. He took the raw materials of a new faith and built a civilization upon them, one that would inspire generations. Through his justice, his humility, and his unbreakable fear of Allah, he became a beacon for what Islamic leadership could and should be. His shadow still stretches across the corridors of history, reminding us that the heart of a leader must always beat with mercy, courage, and accountability. When Uthman ibn Affan accepted Islam, he did so not with hesitation or resistance, but with the quiet clarity that would define his entire life. Born into the wealthy and respected Umayyad clan, Uthman had everything a man could want: status, riches, and comfort. Yet when the call of Islam reached him, he did not cling to worldly attachments. He left behind ease for truth and wealth for the path of service. His soft voice, gentle nature, and modesty concealed a core of unshakable faith. He became one of the earliest converts, and from that moment onward, he never wavered. His devotion was unmatched in generosity. Uthman gave freely in the way of Allah, often without being asked. During the difficult days of the Tabuk expedition, when the Muslim army lacked supplies, Uthman rose and gave hundreds of camels and gold coins. The Prophet, moved by his sincerity, declared, "Nothing Uthman does after today will harm him." His contributions weren't just material. They were spiritual offerings rooted in a heart that saw wealth not as power, but as a trust to be used for the Ummah. Uthman's love for the Prophet was personal and deep. He married not one, but two of the Prophet's daughters, one after the other, earning him the title Dhul Nurayn, the possessor of two lights. When his first wife Ruqayyah passed away, the Prophet offered his other daughter, Kulthum, to him in marriage. There was no other man honored in such a way. The Prophet once said that even the angels were shy before Uthman. He carried himself with such gentleness and modesty that those around him instinctively lowered their voices and softened their demeanor in his presence. When Umar ibn al-Khattab was martyred, the choice of the next caliph came with great caution. A council of 6 companions was formed to decide who would carry the torch of leadership. After careful deliberation, all eyes turned to Uthman. He was known not only for his piety and kindness, but for his deep sense of duty and justice. Though leadership was never his desire, he accepted the role with humility, knowing that the responsibility was heavier than gold. Uthman's caliphate began with blessings and expansion. Islam's reach grew across North Africa, deeper into Persia, and toward the borders of the Byzantine Empire. But with growth came challenges. As the diversity of the Muslim world increased, so too did the differences in language, dialect, and culture. One of the most pressing issues that arose during his time was the variation in Quranic recitation. People in far-off regions were beginning to dispute over how verses were to be read. The unity of the Muslim Ummah was being threatened, not by external enemies, but by internal confusion. Uthman took a decisive step that would forever shape Islamic history. After consulting with companions, he ordered the standardization of the Qur'an. Using the manuscript that had been compiled under Abu Bakr and preserved with Hafsa bint Umar, Uthman appointed a committee led by Zayd ibn Thabit to make copies in the Qurayshi dialect, the dialect of the Prophet. Once complete, these standardized mushafs were sent to key cities across the Muslim world. All other personal copies and regional variations were respectfully collected and destroyed to prevent further discord. This act, though controversial in the moment, was a visionary move. It preserved the unity of the Qur'an and ensured that every Muslim, regardless of location, recited the same words, unified, unchanged, and protected. To this day, the Qur'an as we know it is the direct result of Uthman's action. Yet the later years of Uthman's reign were not filled with the peace his character reflected. As wealth entered the Muslim lands and the early simplicity of the Madinan days faded, so too did the contentment of some hearts. Distant provinces grew restless. Some began to accuse Uthman of favoritism, claiming he appointed family members to governorships. Though many of these accusations lacked context or understanding, unrest grew. Uthman, ever gentle, believed in reconciliation and patience. He did not respond with force. He did not imprison dissenters. Instead, he opened his doors and welcomed dialogue, hoping to calm tensions through love, not fear. But the storm that was brewing could not be stilled by kindness alone. A group of rebels from Egypt and Iraq made their way to Medina. They surrounded Uthman's house, cutting off food and water. The companions of the Prophet, including Ali ibn Abi Talib, tried to mediate and protect him. Uthman, however, forbade anyone from shedding Muslim blood in his name. He knew that fighting back would spark civil war. And so he waited, he prayed, he fasted, and he read the Qur'an. It was during one of those days, with the Qur'an in his lap, that the rebels stormed his home. They struck him as he recited, and his blood spilled onto the sacred pages. The verse upon which his blood fell read, "And Allah will suffice you against them, and He is the hearing, the knowing." Surah Al-Baqarah 2:137. His life ended in the most sacred of acts: worship, patience, and submission to Allah. He did not die a failed ruler. He died a martyr, holding on to the very book he worked so hard to preserve. Uthman ibn Affan's legacy is one of quiet strength. He was not loud nor confrontational. He did not command with force, but with humility and faith. In his silence, he protected the unity of the Qur'an. In his softness, he bore the burden of leadership in one of the most tumultuous times in Islamic history. He showed that sometimes the greatest strength is not in raising your voice, but in holding firm to principle when the world around you begins to crumble. Through his life and death, Uthman left behind a legacy written not just in ink and parchment, but in the hearts of generations. Ali ibn Abi Talib was no stranger to the earliest moments of Islam. As a child, he lived under the same roof as the Prophet Muhammad, raised in his household, fed by his hands, and shaped by his wisdom. He was the first youth to embrace Islam, committing himself to the new faith without hesitation or doubt. From a tender age, he demonstrated a courage that far surpassed his years. When danger loomed, it was Ali who stepped forward, fearless and devoted. During the Hijrah, as the Quraysh plotted to assassinate the Prophet, it was Ali who lay in his bed that night, knowing the assassins were coming, willing to risk his life to ensure the Prophet's escape. That was the essence of Ali's character: selfless, bold, and utterly loyal. As Islam grew, so did Ali's legacy. In every battle, he stood at the forefront. At Badr, Uhud, Khandaq, and Khaybar, his sword never wavered, and his heart never faltered. When others hesitated, Ali advanced. The Prophet once declared, "Tomorrow, I will give the banner to a man who loves Allah and his messenger, and Allah and his messenger love him." That man was Ali. His strength in battle was unmatched, but it was his deep understanding of justice, his eloquence, and his humility that made him more than a warrior. He was the embodiment of knowledge guided by faith. The Prophet called him the gate of knowledge, for his understanding of the Qur'an and the law was unparalleled. His wisdom, sharp and poetic, was drawn from both intellect and divine light. When Uthman ibn Affan was assassinated, the Muslim Ummah trembled with uncertainty. The once united body was fracturing under the weight of anger, confusion, and political tension. All eyes turned to Ali. The people of Medina pleaded with him to take the role of caliph, to guide the Ummah through the storm. Ali did not seek power. He never had. But seeing the peril the community faced, he accepted, not for authority, but for duty. From the very beginning, his caliphate was challenged not by external enemies, but by the wounds left from Uthman's assassination. The blood of the third caliph had not yet dried, and already factions formed, some demanding immediate justice, others calling for stability. Ali stood at the center of this turmoil, a man of truth surrounded by voices of rage. The early days of his rule were spent trying to restore order, to remind the Ummah of its shared values. Ali moved the capital to Kufa, a strategic and political decision meant to strengthen his position in a time of growing unrest. Yet even as he tried to heal divisions, conflict erupted. The first major trial came with the Battle of the Camel, where two prominent companions, Aisha bint Abi Bakr and Talha ibn Ubaidullah, led a contingent demanding vengeance for Uthman's death. Ali, grieved by the confrontation, sought peace, but misunderstanding and manipulation led to bloodshed. Even in war, Ali restrained his forces, forbidding them from harming the wounded, chasing the fleeing, or looting the camps. His aim was never victory for ego, but justice with mercy. Another painful chapter followed with the Battle of Siffin, a confrontation with Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the governor of Syria and relative of Uthman. Muawiyah refused to pledge allegiance to Ali unless the murderers of Uthman were brought to justice. The battle ended not in decisive victory but in arbitration, an agreement that ultimately weakened Ali's position and split his supporters. Out of that split rose the Khawarij, an extremist group that turned against both Ali and Muawiyah. declaring anyone who did not meet their rigid definitions of righteousness to be a disbeliever. Ali, always principled, refused to give in to extremism or political convenience. He confronted the Khawarij at Nahrawan, reluctantly engaging them in battle only after all efforts at reconciliation had failed. Through all this turmoil, Ali remained a pillar of integrity. His governance was marked by an uncompromising sense of justice. He treated the poor and the wealthy with equal fairness. He walked the streets at night, tending to the needy. He lived simply, often patching his own clothes and eating the coarsest food. He did not seek riches or comfort in power. Rather, he carried its burdens with humility. His letters to his governors are still studied today, filled with profound instructions on ethics, justice, and the responsibilities of leadership. In one such letter to Malik al-Ashtar, his appointed governor of Egypt, Ali wrote, "Remember, O Malik, that you are a servant of Allah and you are appointed over the people. So do not become a predator over them." But his time as caliph was destined to end in heartbreak. One morning, as he entered the mosque for Fajr prayer in Kufa, a man named Abdurrahman ibn Muljam, a member of the Khawarij, lay in wait. As Ali bowed in prostration, the assassin struck him with a poisoned sword. The wound was fatal. In his final moments, Ali was calm. He uttered the words, "By the Lord of the Kaaba, I have succeeded." Even in death, he remained focused not on this world, but on the next. Ali ibn Abi Talib's life was not defined by the throne he held, but by the truth he lived. He was a scholar, a warrior, a poet, and a judge. He was the voice of conscience in an age of chaos. While others fought for power, he stood for principle. While others chased wealth, he walked in humility. His legacy is not written only in history books, but etched into the soul of Islam. Through his trials, we see the cost of truth. Through his strength, we understand the meaning of sacrifice. Through his leadership, we glimpse the depth of prophetic guidance lived fully in a man devoted to Allah above all else. The lives of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali were not simply chapters in history. They were luminous beacons guiding a fledgling ummah through its most fragile and formative years. Though each caliph walked a different path, their hearts were aligned in purpose. They were men of vastly different temperaments. Abu Bakr's quiet resolve, Umar's fiery sense of justice, Uthman's soft-spoken generosity, and Ali's deep intellect and unwavering principle. But they were united by one thing: a love for the Prophet and a devotion to the path he left behind. Their leadership was not fueled by ambition, wealth, or worldly conquest. It was built upon trust, fear of Allah, and responsibility to the people. Each of them carried the weight of the Ummah not on their shoulders alone, but in their hearts. They prayed for it, wept for it, and gave everything they had, some even their lives, to preserve its unity and uphold the legacy of the Prophet. They did not rule to be served, but to serve. In their decisions, their sacrifices, and even in their deaths, they left behind a template for what righteous leadership looks like. In times of doubt, we return to their examples. In moments of confusion, we recall their clarity. In a world often searching for direction, their stories remain timeless, powerful, and necessary. Together, they were not just four leaders. They were four lights, distinct in color, yet shining upon the same path, a path carved not by sword or crown, but by faith, truth, and submission to Allah. And for those who follow their footsteps with sincerity, that path still shines today, leading not only through the trials of this world, but toward the eternal peace of the next.